Hello there, it's Dr. John Baugh again, your guide through some web technologies, and today we're going to be discussing PHP and MySQL. So first we'll start with some information about the backend technologies PHP and MySQL or MySQL. So what are backend technologies? Backend, often styled backend, technology are on the server side. So this primarily focuses on the behind-the-scenes data and instructions that are not directly viewable to the user. Often, these technologies organize and generate data to be viewed on the front end. A backend developer is typically more focused on server-side programming, database technologies, APIs, and related technology. So what about PHP? Well, PHP is a server-side programming language. The first major release was in 1995. PHP 2, named Personal Homepage. Second major release in 1998, PHP 3, the acronym was just changed to PHP Hypertext Processor, which is a recursive acronym very popular among computer scientists and software engineers and other IT people because it inserts humor into our grotesque and painful existence. MySQL is a database management system, MySQL or MySQL, a DBMS. So anytime you see that acronym that's talking about the database management system, its history began with Unireg, which was its predecessor in 1981. So after that went through a couple versions, MySQL itself, or MySQL itself, 3.23 was released in 1995 and became very popular with websites. MySQL 4.0 was introduced in 2003, 5.0 in 2005. There were several releases later. Sun Microsystems, which owned Java as well, the Java programming language, acquired MySQL AB, which was the company that made MySQL in 2008. They acquired it in 2008. MySQL AB was actually a for-profit company, but Sun Microsystems acquired MySQL in 2008. It became open source software with heavy contributions, or became more open source friendly in a lot of its licensing and things like that, and became acquired then by Oracle because they basically purchased Sun in 2009. So many of the developers at the time that were working originally for MySQL AB or on the project related to MySQL at Sun were a little bit nervous because Oracle kind of has a habit of acquiring different companies and turning things that used to be open source into a way for them to make profit. So a lot of the developers were a little bit nervous about that. They feared that Oracle would either stop its development altogether on MySQL and just make the Oracle database system the one that everyone used, or they would try to monetize open source software and come up with ways that would make it more difficult for the open source community or others to use it. So they forked, meaning they made a full copy basically of the code before it was established under Oracle, or it had any problems with Oracle, and they forked it, made an entire copy of it, and then called this new thing MariaDB with minimal changes to it. And they've been maintaining this ever since. So a huge number of companies, even though they might say they're using MySQL, they're actually using MariaDB, and that's actually what we'll be using as well. To work with PHP and MySQL with should be relatively few problems, I would assume, or with ease, relative ease or relatively few problems, you should go to ApacheFriends.org. Okay, so we can, here, let me do that. I'll just open the website and show you. So ApacheFriends.org, and then you can download for your platform, and they even maintain other versions, but you can download these different versions here. One of them's for Windows, they've got it for Linux, and they've also got it for Mac OS. So I would recommend getting the most recent version. I think on this particular user account, I don't have the recent version. I have it on my other account, but it'll still work. It'll still do the same things, and the interface is essentially the same. So MariaDB and MySQL, as well as the Apache web server, are available with XAMPP. that allows us to run the various servers and the PHP interpretation engine, Zend. It also installs phpMyAdmin, which actually you open up as if it were just a locally served website. This allows us to visually interact with the MySQL MariaDB database technologies. So that makes our lives a lot easier. We don't have to issue a bunch of commands on the command line to interact with MySQL. There are other ways to do it. You might decide you want to use the console, and that's totally fine. There's SQL, different types of SQL workbenches and things like that you can install that will allow you to interact with a variety of different databases. But phpMyAdmin comes with XAMPP, and it's pretty straightforward to use. So it allows us to run PHP and serve web pages that use PHP from our local machines. Typically, the top-level folder from which they're served is at C XAMPP htdocs. So as soon as you install it, it will create this folder, XAMPP, pardon, and let me see here. We'll go here and see what it looks like. If I go under my PC and C drive, I did just keep it in the default location, XAMPP, but you'll notice this has a lot of other folders in it, and some of it has to do with the other stuff that XAMPP manages, as well as FTP programs and MySQL itself and PHP engine and all this other stuff. But the htdocs folder is usually the only one you're going to be messing with, at least for the standard usage of XAMPP. So if I go in there, you'll notice this has a bunch of stuff as well. So one of the folders I created that did not come with the installation is a projects folder. So I created this folder right here. I think I included in the slides in a little bit. And then under here, I put whichever projects I want to work with. So you can create those subfolders for each project you're working on, or however you want to arrange it. And you can change this, the default location, XAMPP htdocs, inside the http dconf file. So this is XAMPP, just to show you. And if you go to the configuration files for Apache, that's the web server, there's httpd.conf. If I go in there, you can go in here and see a bunch of the settings as well. So it'll tell you what port it's listening on. So I've got it listening on 8080. If you have another web server or something else listening on 8080, that will be a conflict. So you would have to change the port number here. So even though it's using the same IP address, our local host, the port is kind of uniquely identifying a particular process in memory. So you can tell it to use a different port. And there's quite a few open ports available. 80 is the default for web pages when you go on the internet and use the HTTP protocol. But 8080 is a common development server port. So there's other stuff in here and a lot of other commands you can learn how to work with if you're interested. And you can look at that. So document root, you could change some of this information down here and change it so it's not CXAMPP htdocs, but I would just say leave it that way if you're okay with it. So up next, quick example of PHP, just so we can get our feet wet here. So common files that will be needed when dealing with PHP. At a minimum, you'll have HTML and PHP. Obviously, you could have CSS and JavaScript. That's fine too. In some cases, you might need them. Even though the extension for a file being accessed may be PHP, the actual PHP file is not what is served to the user. So if they go to your website and then /index.php or process.php or whatever, it won't actually serve them the actual PHP file if you have a PHP engine running. So browsers themselves do not understand PHP. The PHP file is processed, typically generating data such as HTML, and then it responds with that data. So if the PHP file generated HTML, the response would be HTML, which is understood by the browser. So the PHP isn't, but what it generates is. All right, so this basic example, this is on slide 11. I'll just do it live so that everyone can see how to work with it. So I'm going to go inside Visual Studio. I've got this open. I'm going to go to Open Folder. And this one says we're going to go to the XAMPP folder. I think I'm going to drag that over here to get quicker access to it. It didn't seem like it liked that. Let's try it again. There we go. Okay, there's XAMPP. So there's XAMPP, and I'm going to go into htdocs and projects. So in here, I've already got some folders I've been doing tests with. I might change the name just so you can see it. I'll make one called Hello World 2. That will be the one we'll use. And I'll select that folder. And we'll trust the authors on that because we're the authors. It's empty at this point. The projects just houses whatever top level folder that we're creating for our different projects. So my heat kicked on, so I hope it's not interfering with the audio too much. I'll try to clean it up as best as possible, but it's cold in Michigan. So inside the Hello World folder in VS Code, we're going to create an index.php. And in here, I'll put the boilerplate code for an HTML5 page, and I'm just going to change this to say Hello World Test. And then in here, we'll just do a very, very basic PHP statement. We're going to echo hello world, and we put a semicolon there. And we just have to enclose whatever PHP we have inside these special commands right here so that it becomes a tag or an element that contains PHP. Now, this could be on a different line. We could do this if we wanted to. Usually if it's one line, we'll just keep it simple and keep it in just one single line if it's a single statement. So this echo, this is like a print statement. It is dynamically generating the word hello world into the HTML that will be delivered. Now in XAMPP, in order to actually serve this page, we're going to have a problem if we try to do this. If we try to go to Hello World 2 and just double click index.php or try to load it with a browser or something like that, you're going to have a problem. So this one apparently knows that it needs to be open with Visual Studio Code, so it's trying to accommodate us. But if you tried opening it with a browser, which I should have tried to do just then, give it a second. It's loading. Okay, so we'll kill that. Let me show you what it does if I try to open it with a browser, just to see what it does. So let's see. I guess I could try Firefox. It's probably going to want me to do an update, but let's see what happens. Okay. All right, refresh Firefox. Yes. Okay, that's great. Now, it's not really doing what we want. So let me see here. Well, let's do it one more time. We're going to try. If this doesn't work, I'll try loading it in Chrome. Okay, just once. It does not load anything. It's not printing anything. If we view the page source, we can see it literally sends us the PHP code. It's because it doesn't know how, the browser doesn't know how to interpret this, so it just thinks it's some sort of weird tag that it doesn't know about. So it has no idea how to make heads or tails of it, because the browser is involved with front-end technology, whereas PHP is a back-end technology. So we have to serve it. Now, the way we're going to serve it, the easiest way is, I think, one of the easiest ways, especially when you're learning, is with XAMPP. And we can start the Apache server, Apache process. It'll turn green when it's ready, and then this button start will turn to stop. It'll tell you what port it's running on, 8080. And then MySQL, if I had a database, I could start that. I'm not dealing with a database right now, so we don't have to start that. But right now it's just Apache. It's running on 8080, so that means localhost 8080 is where it's going to be. So let's try that, localhost 8080. And this does, in fact, bring up our kind of welcome to XAMPP thing and allows us to get to phpMyAdmin from here and some other stuff. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go, I know it's the htdocs folder at the top, so I'm going to go into projects, and then I'm going to go to Hello World 2. And there we go. We've got our little Hello World here. And if I look at the actual HTML, view page source, you'll see it does not have, in fact, any kind of PHP statements. Now it's not writing it as well maybe as a human would as far as spacing and stuff, but the browser doesn't really care. You'll see it just says body, hello world, and then the closing tag's still there. It's just over here. So this is not sending back any PHP. That's interpreted at the server side and then served to me when I open up this page. All right, pretty cool. So form submission, there's another example. Form submission and processing are important for many modern applications. You see them all the time when you do things like sign up, log in, submit comments, etc. Those are all forms. Let's do a form example. So that was, we're now on we were on slide 14, now we're on 15. If you're following along with the slides, I'm going to close this folder and I'm going to open another folder. We're going to call it, we'll just call it forms or something like that. Give me a second. Okay, XAMPP, htdocs, projects. We're going to create another folder called forms, I'll call it like the other one, form test 2 this time. And I'll select it. We've got an empty here. There's going to be a couple different files. This one's going to be index.html. And you'll notice in the code, if you're following along with the slide right over here, form action equals, the action specifies which file processes it on the back end. So I just called it process.php. Okay, so it's going to post information there and that's going to process it. So I'm going to actually do that. I'm going to create another folder just to have it ready. Call it process.php. That's just the name I named it. You can name it pretty much anything as long as it's valid. Again, I'm going to generate an HTML file. We'll call this form test. And let me see here. Inside the body, what I'm going to do is I'll make an H1 and say fill in the form and submit. There we go. And then we're going to say, we'll create the form here. Form action is, and since it's in the same folder being served from the server, I know that I can just reference it directly. But just like if it were a JavaScript file or something else, you would have, if it was in a folder, I would have to, use the appropriate, dot slash or dot if it's in the folder above me and things like that. Just like we did with the other types of files like CSS or JavaScript. So here, I'm going to say that the action is process.php, and I'm going to say that the method is post, okay? And we'll create a label for an input I'm about to create. So for first name, okay? And you could just put plain text there, but a lot of people like adding the semantic information by putting a label. So there's the text. I'm going to give it an ID, first name, and you would use ID if you want to style it or sometimes to access it through JavaScript and things like that. And then a name. Now this we typically use on the back end. I usually make it the same, and I would say most people make the name and the ID the same. The name is what's used on the back end in order to access the data from the form that's submitted. Okay, now just to make my life a little bit easier, I'm going to copy and paste this, and then we'll change some stuff. So this one's going to be last name. It's also labeled for last name. I'll change this to say last. It's the input type is a text field, so last name. And I also want to change the name attribute to last name. And finally, the last thing I'm going to do, just because all I'm sending is the first name and the last name, I'll just put input type equals submit. Okay, and that right there is the submit button that will be displayed. All right, pretty cool. Now, as far as the PHP is concerned, if I just loaded the HTML at this point, it would just show the form, but the form's not going to do anything because there's no PHP file or there's the file exists, but it's not doing anything to work with the code or work with the data. So I'm going to create a plain old HTML5 thing here. And we'll say processing the form is the title. And what we'll do here is, first thing I'm going to do is, even above the doc type, I can put a PHP segment. And what this is going to do is it's going to load some variables. The way you declare a variable in PHP is with a $sign in front. And then we say equals $_post. This is a special array. I did not name this. This is part of the system. What it does is it looks for things that have been posted using the post. If you were using the get method over here instead of post, it would be in an array called get. Now, also, just as a note, it's important that you look into the secure ways to do this. You don't want to do this if you have an industrial strength project. Just go directly here. You can do you're going to want to use something like the HTML special chars. And this is going to do what we call sanitizing the input. So if someone were to try to be sneaky and submit maybe, SQL commands to do an SQL injection attack, or, put some HTML even with JavaScript inside using some angle braces and things like that, what HTML special chars does is it strips it of different things that could affect this. So, and make it so that they might gain access to your database or do something else to it. So that does, it's not foolproof, I would say, maybe against an SQL injection attack, but it is good at removing special characters and things in HTML. There's other techniques we can learn about how to prevent other types of attacks. But for right now, let's just do this. We'll do, I think in the slides I didn't use HTML special chars just to show you the basics, but I would recommend doing this and getting used to doing this, and it's called sanitizing the input. Okay, so you've got first name and last name. That's really all we want. We just grab the first name and last name when this particular file is called based on the action of the form. When you hit the submit button, it will grab the data that is labeled first name and also the data that's labeled last name as the name attribute. So that's what it's looking for, things with the name attribute. So that on the PHP side, when the HTML form is submitted, it creates an array for you, and anything in that that was posted goes in the post array. Anything that had a get was get array, etc. So let's do this. We're going to put another, inside the body down here. I'm going to put PHP again, and we're going to say echo, and then H2, hello there, and then I could do concatenation if I wanted to, so I could use a dot for concatenation, but instead of doing that, we can use something called string interpolation. And you have to have the double quotes on this. So normally you could use single quotes with strings, but if you're using interpolation, you have to have double quotes. So here, one second. So this is just so you don't have to end the string and then concatenate it. It'll just insert it exactly where you need it inside. So I'm going to put curly braces around it. I don't think these are necessary for this particular type of variable, but we could just do... oh no, I think they are. Yeah, I think they are for this. Okay, so first name and then last name right there. And then we will close the H2 there, and that's what's echoed. You notice it does recognize that these are variables it's getting from somewhere. So it will just splice in the first name and last name that was retrieved up here from the submission and print it out to the user. So let's... you have to run the Apache web server if you haven't already. But let's see what this looks like. Since it's already running the web server, I don't really have to worry about it. I just do form test 2, and we've got fill in form and submit. So I'll put John Baugh and hit submit. And if we got an error, then we could go back and see what was wrong. But it says, hello there, John Baugh. If I go back, I put, Alice... Snuggles, and it says hello there, Alice Snuggles. So we are getting data in the back end from the front end. So this is very, very powerful. And we'll leave that there for just now. Now, next up, what we're going to do is, there's a dead folder, a dead file I found. Okay, so the next thing we're going to look at is some more on PHP syntax, and you notice my little humor, it's good to has good grammar. Syntax in a programming language is very, very important, because if you violate it, you've essentially violated the grammar of the language. And programming languages are far less forgiving than natural languages like humans speak. Okay, so when it's kind of an infamous thing, John F. Kennedy wanted to show his support for the people in West Berlin, who were on the capitalist side, and then you had the communist side on the East Berlin, and there was the Berlin Wall, and he went there and he was showing support for the people in Berlin. So he said famously, "Ich bin ein Berliner," and in German you should have said "Ich bin Berliner," which means I am Berliner, I am a person from Berlin. But if you say "Ich bin ein Berliner," it can have the connotation of I'm a jelly donut. A Berliner is a style of donut. So, but the people were forgiving. It might come off as a little bit humorous at the time, but it was understandable what he meant. But with programming languages, a lot of times they're not very forgiving. They're not understanding what you mean unless you're very explicit. So, PHP language, user-defined classes and functions and keywords are case insensitive. So a word that comes from the language like echo, typically we write it as all lowercase. You really should do that. But you could write it pretty much any way you want it, as long as it's ECHO. But variable names, on the other hand, are not case insensitive. They are case sensitive. So if you have $name versus $name with capital letters versus $name with mixed letters, those would be three different variables entirely. Constants, there's no $, and you use the define function to declare and initialize them. So for example, if I call define, and I say first parameter is tax rate, comma, and then 0.06f, that would make a 6% tax rate, maybe we're defining. So we say tax rate represents this 0.06f for floating point, and then we can echo the tax rate. Comments, pretty much what you expect. We've got the single line comments and the multi-line comments, just like we have in C, C++, Java, but it also has this style comments, which are called shell style comments. This is probably familiar to you if you use Python or different types of batch scripting and things like that, shell scripting. So the # also acts as comments as well. So general identifier rules, the names of variables, classes, functions, etc. Variables always begin with a $. They cannot start with a number or a keyword. For example, tax amount, number, _fun, name one are all valid, but things like this, like one thing, if you put the 1 at the front, that's not valid. It can have a number in it, but you can't put it at the front. $+ symbol, that's not valid because that's an operator, and $not are all invalid. Now, why $not? Well, this is the logical not in PHP, NOT. Okay, here are functions. Functions are not case sensitive, but it's wise to use consistent case. And then there's PHP keywords. I'm not going to read all these, but these are all the keywords that you have to worry about with PHP. So just keep these in mind when you're working with PHP, that there are a lot. But you'll see some that probably look kind of familiar, like you have else, you have if, you have function if you're coming from certain languages like JavaScript, right? This is not too different. We have a for and a for each. You have some that you probably can figure out what they do, but may not be as familiar with for you. So else if and end if, those are possible things you could use. Else if, else, and if go together pretty well. And we have the new keyword, but you also have things like and, or, and not, as mentioned before, return, static, switch, throw, try, catch. So a lot of these are just super familiar, break. So we've seen these before, but some of them might not be as familiar, like the die command, or maybe if you're coming from C++, you're not as familiar with implements. Or goto, what does that do? Well, we don't usually use the goto statement because you could get arrested, but that's another story. Data types. So 8 data types exist in PHP. We've got 4 that are scalar types, which are just single value. These types are integer, floating point numbers, strings, and booleans. 2 are considered compound. These are arrays and objects. Arrays are just the simplest data structure that we have available, and then objects are, instances of classes. 2 are special types. We have one called resource and one that's the value null. So this is, even though in C++ you're supposed to use null PTR, null pointer, if you're from a C++ background, or use the lowercase null in Java or lowercase null in JavaScript. If you're familiar with the old style, really old style C++, or people using a define to make this capital null with the C language, this is probably familiar with you. But this just basically means isn't holding a type or isn't holding a reference to anything. It's just nothing. That's what null is. So a little note on strings. Strings can be delimited by single or double quotes, but unlike with JavaScript where it's identical behavior, with PHP it's not identical behavior. In double quotes, variables are interpolated. Their values inserted, while in single quotes, they're not. So interpolation would look like this. Now, it doesn't really matter if this line had single quotes around it. It would still be a string. If you go to echo something, and you say echo hi name, how are you? And it's in double quotes, and you have this $ thing here, then it will interpolate it. But if you insert whatever, it'll insert John. It'll say, hi, John, how are you? Instead of hi $name. But if you put single quotes, it'll put hi $name. So make sure you use double quotes in that situation. Some notes on arrays. You can use regular array indices just like you might be familiar with from other languages, right? Names at 0 equals John, names at 1 equals Bob. But you can also use associative array syntax. So capital of Michigan is Lansing, capital of Alaska is Juneau. So you can do stuff like that. So you can also create arrays with the array function if you want. So you could say people equals array, and then in parentheses you put comma separated list of these elements that go in that array. Since this is an array of strings, they each have quotes around them. So they could be double or single, it doesn't really matter. But you could also do this in a more associative manner. If I wanted to make capital or capitals, I could say equals array, but here I would put, say, Michigan. That serves as the index or the key, and then you put a equal sign greater than sign. It looks like the fat arrow function in JavaScript, but it's not. It just means this right here, key, has the following value, Lansing, comma, this right here, Alaska, which is a key, has the following value, Juneau. All right, so control statements. Wait a minute here. Yeah, control statements. Just like all fully imperative languages, there are 3 categories of control statements. We have sequential, that's the default, no branching, repeating. We've seen that in our example so far. But you can also have selection control and repetition control. So the selection control consists of if, which is a single selection control statement. You have the if-else, which is a double selection control statement, which you can do one thing or the other, whereas if is just you do it or you don't, right? But then you can chain them using if, else if, else if, whatever, and then they end with an else. So the else if is combined here. You don't put a space. That's a specific keyword, else if. So that's if you want to chain them. So that's for triple and multi-way selection. Note there's no space again between the else and the if. Switch, as you might expect, switch case statements in PHP exist, and they are multi-way selection. And there's a little example over here. So age 18, if age is greater than or equal to 18, here's your voter ID. If it's greater than or equal to 21, here's your beer. Otherwise, here have a Dr. Pepper, because it assumes they're neither greater than or equal to 18, nor greater than or equal to 21. And, oh, you know what? This isn't going to work right. This needs to be switched. See? We're making changes here right there. Let me switch this and then change the ages, and I'll explain why. That was a little logic bug there, just the way I have it set up. So if their age is greater than or equal to 21, here have a beer. If they're greater than or equal to 18, here's your voter ID. Otherwise, we will have, tell them they should have a Dr. Pepper. So the reason I swapped them is because if I left it with the greater than or equal to 18, if they were 22 or 27 or whatever, that would be greater than or equal to 18, and that would have resolved it. So you have to put the larger one first. So this catches in order. If this one's false, meaning they're not at least 21, it'll go to the second one, which will then test are they at least 18, and then the last ones if they're anything under 18. And then, of course, we have the standard repetition control that you pretty much expect, the three you probably are familiar with from other languages: while, do while, and for. For loop is index-based. You write, for, and then the $i equals 1 or 0, semicolon is I less than this, and then $i plus plus. You do that just like you do in the other languages, many of the other languages you might be familiar with. But for each might be a little bit more foreign to you if you're not coming from a language that has this. This is similar to the enhanced for loop in Java or the range-based for loop in C++, and for each constructs in languages like C# and others. This is element-based, so this one's you're going to say something like for each, S in my list of strings or whatever, and then you can print them out instead of going based on an index. Next up, a little bit of fun with MySQL and MariaDB. Okay, so a database, just some basics in case you haven't had any kind of database course or any kind of database training. A database is a collection of tables, and a table is seen as a collection of records. The table is usually viewed with the records as rows and the columns as fields, indicating individual characteristics of the data. So for example, if you have a person table, I might have my own entry, which would be as a record in that table. You might have another one, and then someone else might have another. And these are each individual rows. So each row represents a single entity within the table. The columns are the different pieces of data or fields related to that those records. So for example, one column might be for first name, another column might be for second name, another column might be for birth date or age or something. Those would be the individual characteristics of that data. And then each record or row has specific field values for those specific entities. SQL or SQL is a declarative programming language. Some people will argue up and down it's not a programming language, but I would definitely say it is. SQL is a programming language. It's just not imperative or object-oriented. It's declarative. So in this sense, you're saying what you need. You're not telling it how you do it, how to do it. So in an imperative language, it literally is in the name of the paradigm. Imperative, you are explaining, you're ordering it, you're commanding it to do something, you're telling it exactly what it needs to do. With declarative programming, you give an example. You say, like, give me books whose author is Baugh, or give me pets who are dogs. You basically tell it what to do that way. It used to stand for Structured English Query Language, so a lot of people will pronounce it SQL. It seems to be a lot of the older crowd use the term SQL, and then SQL, naming out the letters, is a more slightly newer thing. So if you have a really much older database person, they might use the term SQL a lot. I kind of picked up that habit because when I both in industry and also working in academia with people who are very big in database technology, some of them do use the term SQL still. They're both considered pretty standard and interchangeable, but even though it's just still SQL now, those letters instead of SEQL, and it doesn't really stand for English anymore, even though it is kind of based on English, we don't call it Structured English Query Language. It's just Structured Query Language. So either or, it doesn't really matter which you prefer. I kind of bounce back and forth. I probably should be more consistent, but I'm not. So the database basics, again, an example table. So this might be a table of authors. You can see that there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 columns, which are the fields. So it has an ID field, an author field, title, type, and year fields. And then you have things like the individual records, okay? So the first record, the first row, is author's Mark Twain. That's its field value for that author, for the author. The field value for the title of the first record is The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. It's fiction, and then 1876. And you get down here, you got things like Shakespeare, George R. R. Martin, whatever. Each field's identified uniquely by its primary key. So when you identify in a database, in a relational database like MySQL or Postgres or any of that, you need to have a way of typically of uniquely identifying a row. Now, using the author name might seem like a decent way to do it, but not only does it have to do more comparisons because it's a big old string, let's say you have two authors named Charles Dickens. It's probably not the case, but maybe this is a different Charles Dickens than lived in the 1800s. Maybe it's a different one. And that wouldn't be a very good primary key, okay, to uniquely identify the entity. So we typically use things like IDs. Now, this ID doesn't really have anything to do, like, why is Mark Twain 1 and not Charles Dickens? Why is Shakespeare 3 and not George R.R. Martin, etc.? But it's just a number for that particular row in here. So you don't want to, when you do delete records, you obviously don't want to, reuse an ID. So even if I deleted Charles Dickens, everything else would not shift up and get that new number. Like William Shakespeare wouldn't become 2 and George Martin wouldn't become 3 and anything below wouldn't become 4. It does not work that way. You don't want to do it that way. You delete the entire row and don't reuse that ID. Because there may be systems that have already transferred this data, or it might be in another table, maybe. It's being referenced as what we call a foreign key. Okay, foreign key, that means if another table, like let's say there's an entire books table and it's referencing information about these authors, or maybe the author name wouldn't even be in here. It would be in an authors table, and this would just be a book table. And it would go entirely based on this to know, maybe it has like an author ID and just uses the number. And then in the other table, you can reference it. It can, let's say this is author 12, it's just book number 1. It'll go over to the other table and say, oh yeah, author 12 was born in this year, grew up in this city, in this state, lived until he was blah, blah, blah. Here's his birth date, all this other stuff. Here's some interesting historical fact about them. So you could do that with multiple tables. But when you reference another table's primary key that isn't your own table, that's called a foreign key. Okay. MySQL MariaDB is one of the most popular database management systems in the world. It's free to use, even if you use it in commercial software. And a quick and easy interface to work with MySQL is phpMyAdmin. So we're going to do some basic stuff with this. I'll, again, segue to our practical studies here. So I'm going to go over here, and in order to use the database management system, there has to be a database management server running. So MySQL has to be running. If I hit start here, okay, good. Give it a second, make sure it doesn't kill it. Good. It says that it's running on port 3306, and this is a process ID over here, and it's turned to green, and that's how I know everything seems to be working okay. So I've got that running. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to navigate to phpMyAdmin. So I'm going to go to localhost, and then 8080. You'll notice it does take me to this main page. And I could just click over here, or I could just type, instead of dashboard, I can type phpMyAdmin like that, and it goes directly there. This is phpMyAdmin. It's got a pretty reasonably usable interface. I wouldn't say it's it's pretty clean. I mean, it's a relatively clean interface, but it also has a lot of stuff that you need to do. So we're going to create a new database. The slides say to create a database called testdb1, but since I already have that here, I'm going to create a different one. So here's a new database. I'm going to give it, call it testdb2, in this case, testdb2, and hit create. And now it's asking me, do I want to create tables, right? So to do that, I'm going to create a table called people. And 4 columns is actually what we do need, so we'll just leave that number there. You can increase or decrease as needed. I'm going to hit create, and now I have the table. So you can actually look over here and see testdb. If I expand that, you can't really see anything in it right now because the table's not actually generated. I have to save it first, so I guess I have to redo that, or it's not going to work. There we go. Yeah, it had no information in it, otherwise it would stay. So I told it I wanted 4 columns in it, The 4 columns that I'm going to add are person ID, and I want to check this thing called AI. That doesn't mean artificial intelligence in this case. It means auto increment. You can even hover over it. That's what it says. That will essentially make it the primary key and also make it so that you don't have to enter data for it. It will automatically fill out the data. So it'll have like, element 1, element 2, element 3. It'll do that automatically for you within a given table. And keep that as int. I want to have, we'll just put the names here. First name, last name. We also want age, maybe. Probably, in reality, you'd probably want to set a birth date, but we're going to keep it pretty easy here. So you got age at the bottom. These two right here, first name and last name, are clearly not integers. You could use text, or you could use varchar. We'll just use varchar and tell it we want just up to 64 characters for both. That's a lot, but someone might have a really long name. The other thing, let me see if there's anything else here. Yeah, we just verify that that's the primary key. Everything seems okay. And then near the bottom here, you want to click the Save button. And there you go. We've created our table. Now you'll notice over here now, if I do this little expansion here, I do have a widget where I can click it and say New Table. And notice this is all a web page too. Someone wrote all this code for us, including referencing its own database. And some other cool stuff like that. But we have a people table here, and you'll see that I can actually see the columns through here right there. So I can add new columns if I want, but I see age, first name, last name, and then it shows person ID is an integer and the primary key. But over here, I can see the key next to it. I know that's the primary key. There's a bunch of parts of the interface that keep reminding you what goes where and what is, what belongs. So I'm going to go over to there's a bunch of tabs up here. I could enter my own SQL if I wanted to. That would be totally fine. But my phpMyAdmin makes it a little bit easier, at least for the initial stuff, to add some data to the database that we can work with. And I would recommend doing this at least at first, because it tends to be easier if you're dealing with just retrieving data at first before you worry about updating and inserting. So when you deal with database technologies, there's this acronym. I'm just going to type it here real quick, called CRUD. So you've got create, read, update, delete, and a full database or full data management system is going to provide all of those features. It doesn't mean everyone gets to do all of them, but they have to be available in the system. So we do have create, read, update, and delete type features in different ways. So you could issue SQL commands that create a brand new database, but we did it through phpMyAdmin. You could create a new row, which is inserting. That's what we're just doing here. You can read, which is what we're also going to do. You can update, which is changing things that are already there, and you can delete, which is removing. So that's called CRUD. Now for this, we're going to add just 4 individuals to our table. Don't type anything in the top one, because that's an auto increment. Person ID is auto increment. So for first name, I'm just going to put John, and then last name is Baugh. And then we're going to put that, I'm 28, because I know. That's exactly right. So it ran the SQL, and it tells me there was one row inserted, right? So pretty cool. It showed me even the SQL. If I want to learn a little bit more, it'll actually show me what SQL statement it actually issued. So if you wanted to issue this from your PHP code or some other code, you would know what the SQL actually looks like to do this from that code. So if I go back to insert, I'm going to add another one. So we'll put Frank Robbins, and he is 32. I'm going to hit go on that, go back to insert, do it a couple more times. Sally Bupkis, Sally, and then Bupkis, and then she is 20. And we'll hit go to insert, and then we'll do Oliver, and then Pringles. He is 57. Hit go. And we can view that data if we go under Browse. So we just inserted a bunch of stuff. Let's go to Browse. And we can see that all of this information is separated appropriately by their different field values, and we could do stuff with this through phpMyAdmin. But this is a program someone else wrote. This does help us, and it's totally okay to use it if you have to, especially if you have to enter a bunch of data. There are ways to do some batch processing and things like that, but this would be an okay way to do it. It is used by people who use database management systems, but you might be interested in, well, how do I get my PHP to interact with the MySQL? Well, I'm glad you asked, because that's next topic. How do we access a DBMS through the PHP code? Here's a list of general steps. It looks like a lot. It's not really that much, but we have to connect to the database to start. So you have to basically request connection to the database management system, MySQL. Say, hey, can I connect? You'll have to use some sort of authentication to that system. You have to select which database you're using. Otherwise, the system might have 100 databases it's managing and it doesn't know which one you want, so you have to tell it. And you have to be authenticated to it. Create a query string. So we're going to just store a string, an SQL string, an SQL query in a PHP string, in our case PHP, in double quotes, single quotes, whatever. Run the query. So we have to actually issue the query to the database management system. We can retrieve the results, and then we can output or otherwise use those results somehow. So it could generate pages, it could just display a bunch of names, and then we would repeat the above until we retrieve all the data we need. And then at the end we want to typically do some sort of disconnect from the database. Okay, so first what we're going to do is we're going to create a user to access the database. We could use the root user, but it's really not a good idea because that has access. That's like the super user of the entire phpMyAdmin and MySQL system. We don't want to do that. But we're going to give the new user the ability to select, insert, delete, and update. And you could use some of the built-in technologies under privileges, but I'm going to issue an SQL statement just to make it a little bit more interesting. And I could actually practice right here from with SQL here if I wanted to. So I could just do this and then issue the query by hitting go, like select from people where one. It'll show the different results and things like that. So where true, that doesn't really help me very much, does it? But we could let me see here where. We'll say, let me see here, first name equals John. Let's see if that'll give us something. Okay, and it does. It just returns the one row that has my name. So that does show you that this SQL system is working. A select statement is very common with SQL. It is a completely other language, so at least for my students in person, I'm not asking you to become experts with SQL necessarily right away, or even by the end of the class, but this should give you a taste. There's select statements, insert statements, update statements, and delete statements. So as far as this is like retrieving. Okay, so instead of retrieve, it's a select. Star means everything, and then from people, where, and then you can put conditions here. If I just say select star from people, it'll return all the records in the database. But here's a particular command that isn't used nearly as common, but we'll say I'm granting the select, insert, delete, and update privileges on testdb2.star. So any table within testdb2 is what this means. So the database testdb2.star. And I'm going to say to, and we'll say PHP user at localhost, and then identified by, this is where we put the password for that user. So I'm going to put PA55W0 or WORD. So it looks like the word password, but the SS is 55. This is a terrible password, by the way, but it's just for examples. So I hit go. It says MySQL returned an empty set. That's okay, because that particular query doesn't return a set. But you could go under privileges, and you can see that this has been added. Okay, so this particular This is a database specific user called PHP user. It shows me the privileges and it shows me which database and which table which table in this case we're talking about. So we're good on that. Now, what we're going to do, that was slide 40 and 41, by the way. So now we're going to create another project in VS Code. We've got everything set up that we need really over here in phpMyAdmin, right? So over in VS Code, I'm going to sneak over here. And I'm going to close the current folder that's there and create a new one by going to Open Folder. There we go. And I'm going to go over to XAMPP, htdocs, projects, and we're going to call this, in the slides, I put PHP and MySQL. I think I'm going to call it PHP and MySQL 2. Okay, just so I have something a little bit different and can retype some stuff. We have a couple different options here. We could use different technologies. One of them is PDOs. That actually is an object-oriented way to use to access these commands. But there's also a fairly familiar older functional style, but it's very straightforward and easy to use, called MySQL-I. So we'll stick with that. There's a really old version just called MySQL. We're not going to use that command. We'll use the MySQL-I, so we'll stick with that. But I encourage you to look up the PDO stuff. Okay, so I'm just going to create an index.php this time. I'm not using a form or anything. So for this one, I'm going to put PHP, and then the entire thing's basically going in here. This one's, we're not really doing too much. You know what I could do, though? Let me do this. This is different from what I did in the slides, just to make it a little bit, I put slides for my students. This is a little bit different from what I had in there because I didn't put much HTML in there, or properly or well-formed HTML. So what I'm going to do here is I'll just put it all in the body, which you don't have to. You could put it elsewhere, but we'll do it in here. So first I have to connect, right? Connect to the database. So I'm going to say MySQL-I. This is MySQL-I _connect. Now the variable you could name anything, but we're going to say it's on localhost, and it's PHP user, and it's, in this case, password. That's the third parameter, and then the fourth one tells you which database. So I'm going to say testdb2, okay, not 1 like I did in the slides. If you're doing this for the first time at home and you don't already have a testdb1, then feel free to use testdb1 as the name. I'm just doing it with a 2 because I already had a 1. So we're going to check the connection now. So if MySQL-I connect error, okay, if there's an error, I want to echo failed to connect to MariaDB. Okay, and then I'll concatenate that with MySQL-I arrow connect error. And then you could also just do the die statement if you want to. There was an error connecting to the database. You could do that. Not database. That's a database that you really love. Database. Did you get it? That was a good joke. All right. So if we get here, the connection was successful. Okay. By that point, we're going to now create the query. You know what, actually, let's just do a test real quick. Let's do an echo, yay, it worked. Okay, and that's all we're going to do. We're just going to say, yay, it worked. So I've got PHP. The PHP runs with the Apache server, and I've got MySQL, and I've got my table created. I just want to see if the connection works. If it didn't, we'll have to figure out why. So let's just do that first. So I'm going to go to localhost 8080/projects/PHP and MySQL 2, and it says, yay, it worked. So that means we did successfully get to the connect to the database. So that's excellent so far. We'll go back to our code here, And in this case, if it's gotten to this point, we can now create a query. So I'll erase that for now. We'll say my query is just select star from people. So it's going to the people table in the database testdb2 that we've connected to. I'm issuing a select statement just like I did in phpMyAdmin, but that's a program someone else wrote that allows us to issue SQL in there and see the stuff displayed very easily. But if we're releasing a web project of some sort or web application, it would behoove us to know how to interface the PHP and the MySQL. And this is how you do it. So I just store the actual SQL, which is code for SQL that PHP doesn't understand. We're just storing it as a string in this new variable called query. As far as PHP is concerned, this is just any other variable that's a string. It doesn't know anything about SQL. But we use the special commands like this. If I do result equals MySQL I underscore query, that's a function. I pass it MySQL I, and then the query. That's what you do. And then I say while row equals, and this is where we actually fetch the individual data. I'm going to fetch the result, and it's saying to fetch each time you're fetching an array. The row is actually going to pick up an array type structure of data to match the fields. Okay, so since we have 4 fields, it will actually be an array with 4 cells in it. So pretty cool. Let's echo. And I'm going to use some of the syntax we used before. So row at 1, and then I'm going to do space, another set of curly braces here. We don't need row at 0 because row at 0 is just the ID. I don't really care about that. I just want to put their name and say how old they are. So I'm going to say row 2, and then say is, and then, oops, that didn't close, did it? Okay, there we go. And then say row at 3, and then say years old. And then maybe a line break just to make it a little bit nicer. Semicolon at the end. And then we probably want to close our connection to the database with MySQL I close. All right, that's pretty much all I've got. Let's see what we need to do here. And, I guess it's, you know what? It's $sign MySQL close. Oops. There we go. Let's refresh that. And there we go. So it closed. It looks like it's printing an extra curly brace, so something is off slightly. There's curly braces, curly braces, curly braces. Oh, there's one over here. It doesn't need that. We don't need that. That was just out of habit. So we refresh it. We see John Baugh is 28, Frank Robbins is 32, Sally Bupkus is 20, and Oliver Pringles is 57. If I look at the HTML, you can see it's not particularly beautiful. I would not want a student to type it out like this, but you got to understand, this is a PHP. What we see here is front-end technology right here, right? Front-end technology, front-end code, HTML that the browser understands, that is getting its data from PHP, which is a back-end technology, which is accessing MySQL, which is database technology on the back end. So we've got a very, very simple, pretty much a full stack application here. It's accessing the data. It's very, very simple. It's not production ready or anything by that stretch of the imagination. But it's not really that much code. PHP gets a lot of flack. A lot of people make fun of it because it's older, and they're like, oh, it's not the new sexy technology. At one point, everyone was like, oh, let's use Ruby on Rails. Everyone just loves Ruby on Rails. And now it's much harder to find people who know how to use Ruby on Rails. A lot of students might be thinking, what's that? Well, 15 years ago, everyone was like, oh my gosh, we have to do Ruby on Rails. Everyone needs to learn that or you'll never have a job. But PHP has lived through that. It lived long before that, and it'll probably live for quite a while to come. There are some systems like Laravel and Symfony that use PHP that are very much more modern. Some of the people just don't like the syntax. They want kind of newer, sexier syntax, or want it to use JavaScript like Node does. We will talk about that in a different video, hopefully. But PHP is very much alive. There's still about probably 70% of the top million web pages or so still use PHP in some capacity. I'm pretty sure Netflix uses PHP. Facebook does use some PHP. So it's not a dead technology. So don't let anyone fool you on that. And another thing students and earlier developers need to know, and even advanced developers, is that you might end up working for a company that may not want to rewrite their entire system, and it might be in PHP. Maybe it was written in the late 90s, and maybe people tweaked it to update it a little bit here and there when new features came out, but it's still PHP. They don't want to spend the $200,000-$300,000 for you and a bunch of people to rewrite the system in Node just because you can. So it may not make sense. So this is actually still perfectly good technology. It's easier, I think, for a lot of students to start with, especially if you come from where you already know some languages. And if you're familiar with C++ or Java, this might feel more natural. Some of it might feel a little more natural than some of the wacky things you have to do with JavaScript. But every language has its own intricacies, right? All right, so that's pretty much what I have for you this time. I would recommend that there are actually some good other resources related to PHP and MySQL. The W3 Schools, a lot of people bash it too, but it does have a lot of really good stuff on it. So W3 Schools, PHP and MySQL, using them together. And also, I have found that, at least this is pretty new as of the recording of this this lecture, Brocode's PHP full course. If you want a really deep dive into PHP and you want to see how do we make classes in PHP, because those exist, and to do a bunch of other stuff, then Brocode's PHP full course. It's 4 hours long, but if you're like really into PHP and you want to learn more about it, I would say you've gotten a taste with me. For right now, move on over to Brocode's stuff if you want to learn a lot more or you need it for projects or what have you. It's a good move. So that's what I have for you this time. I hope that was educational and that you found it enjoyable. And I will see you next time. Thanks, Dr. J.